Mr. Gaspar, thank you very much for this interview. The rising global debt is causing many to sound the alarm about a possible crisis looming. The US is no exception, and just a few days ago, billionaire Ray Dalio warned that the situation in the US right now when it comes to public debt is casting a very similar shadow to that pre-World War II. How worried are you?
Thanks very much for a very complete question that allows me to give you an overview of our views about public finance, public debt, and public debt risks at this point in the world economy. One of our headline messages for the annual meetings is that debt is high, and at this point in time, global public debt is rising fast and is projected to go above 100% of global GDP by 2029. Risks are also on the upside, which means that it's more likely that debt will grow even faster than it is that it will slow down. Part of the reason for this development is that we have changed the macroeconomic environment quite severely some years ago when interest rates start rising. For a long period of time, debt was rising, but interest rates were coming down so that the burden on budgets was more or less steady. But since 2021, interest rates have increased, and from 2023, public debt also turned up. So we have this coincidence of public debt rising, interest rates rising, the burden of interest payments on budget is increasing as well. In the world, round numbers, rough numbers, in 2020, the interest bill on budget was about 2% of GDP, and now it's approaching 3% of GDP. It's a very large pressure. Now, if you look at financial markets right now, you see that assets have their valuations stretched. You have a situation where spreads are narrow, credit risk spreads are narrow. In such a situation, financial risks can materialize. And in a situation where governments are in a vulnerable position, one of the scenarios that we worry most about is one in which there is a fiscal, financial, adverse feedback loop. And we have shown some years ago that when countries have fiscal space, they can manage a financial crisis to minimize impacts on employment and economic activity and make sure that the recovery comes fast. Countries that are constrained, that don't have fiscal space, that don't have fiscal buffers, on the contrary, have to suffer, have to endure falls in employment and economic activity that are much more pronounced, and a recovery that takes much longer to come.
How problematic for you is the global push into spending more on military?
So we use a frame to look at the political pressures on the budget right now, and we call it a fiscal policy trilemma. Part of the trilemma has to do with spending pressures. The spending pressures at this point in time come first from the increase in interest burdens on budget that I've already referred to, and then you have other pressures that are different across countries in the world. For many countries in the world, population aging, having to do with spending on pensions and health, is a pressure. For others is priorities that are put on security and defense, like in your example. Still for others, it has to do with spending which is necessary to promote growth and development. For others, it is competitiveness. But in any case, most countries around the world are facing spending pressures of different natures. At the same time, countries face resistance to increases in taxation, to new taxes. If you have a situation like the one I described, where you have relatively high debt, relatively high deficits, if you have pressures on spending and you cannot increase taxation, you will have a perpetuation of deficits that push public debt up, and that threatens fiscal sustainability and financial stability. That's the trilemma. How do you get around the trilemma? You have already hinted at one very important element, which is growth. Right? So if one can deploy fiscal policy as structural policy with other structural policies to promote growth, one eases the trilemma, because growth endogenously generates additional revenues which create fiscal space. The fiscal monitor looks at public spending composition and public spending efficiency, and shows how these two dimensions are very important for the growth performance of countries. But more generally, it's very important to invest, so to speak, in public trust, because public trust allows countries to have a very good social and political cohesion that allows them to respond rapidly to changing circumstances, and that's part of a resilient economy, it's part of a resilient society.
Let me ask you about pension funds in the developed countries, where we are witnessing an aging population and an increased attack on immigration systems. How does that change the pension landscape in developed countries?
So 6 months ago in April, we looked at the political economy of pension reform in the fiscal monitor, and we identified that very transparent communication, explanation of the financial constraints associated with social security systems, and a consultation with the most relevant stakeholders was extremely important to build a consensus around the process of reform of social security. This very morning, I had I participated in a panel, I moderated a panel on pension reform, and in that context, the panelists were very much emphasizing that the political elements of the process of reform are crucial, and they were arguing that the reform of the pension system should be thought through in terms of a social contract, one generation to the next, and should be put in the context, in the broad context of economic and financial development. For example, when one makes a transition to a fully funded defined contribution system, one can mobilize the savings that are accumulated in the system to foster capital market development, and so the financing of, say, innovation, as you were emphasizing a moment ago. At the same time, you do have cases around the world where difficult reforms were passed that create much stronger resilience in the system. For example, Sweden and Japan have indexed the age of retirement to life expectancy in quite a mechanical way, and that does help the system to become self-sustained in a prudent way.